In our everyday lives, the idea of popping off to the woods for a relaxing walk, taking in the sights and sounds of nature and appreciating the natural beauty of our world is a luxury. In the rather bleak world of Warhammer's Old World, a stroll into the woods might very well end with a well-placed arrow to the bonds. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my faction overview series, and today we'll be taking a look at the Azrae, also known commonly as the Wood Elves. These tree-hugging knife-ears are heavily inspired by Tolkien's Mirkwood Elves, a mysterious and not all that welcoming sort who guard their forest homes against all trespassers with the same cold efficiency as a civil servant working in the benefits department. I.e., they don't care who you are and what you have any reason for being in their forest. As such, the Wood Elves are a kind of neutral faction in the old world. They largely keep to themselves, unless dire circumstances demand they intervene or support other factions against greater threats. The Wood Elves have a few start locations in Warhammer 3, with the vast majority of them starting in the Great Forests bordering the lands of Bretonnia. Here the likes of Orion and Durthu can be found. And over to the east, near Kislev, is the renegade Dryad Dryad and her magically enthralled elves. And finally, over to the far west, nestled amongst the Dark Elves, Lizardmen and Undead, are the Sisters of Twilight. Naturally, you'll find these sneaky snipers in any location where ancient forests grow, and their goal is to ensure the continued growth and protection of such. So, one of the most important elements of playing the Wood Elves is the acquisition of Amber. This magical resource is a key element in your faction strategy, as it basically allows you to research the technologies needed to improve your units in a number of different ways, taking advantage of the knowledge of the trees. Just go with me on this. Apparently poplars have wisdom that buffs Treekin with better armor or something. Amber, though, is a reward for doing things like healing your forest settlements and performing a ritual with each stage that grants better regional bonuses like improved healing for units in the local terrain, higher income per turn, and less Bigfoot hunters traipsing around your woods. On the campaign map, the Wood Elves have unique settlement chains that ignore climate and regional factors, and almost exclusively rely on their main settlements for any expansion. Any smaller settlements that you do take control of can be converted into outposts, which can enhance your economy or act as early bulwarks against invasion, or even as a jump-off point for your own raiding and faction elimination. All forests have a health rating, which represents how strong the trees have become and what woodland animals will come out when you start singing. Forests then are healed slowly by killing enemies within the forest's region on the map, or by raising, capturing, or allying with neighbouring territories. And once you have enough health restored, you can perform a ritual of rebirth, which fully restores the forest, and leads to your eventual campaign victory. So to aid in this sneaky style of play, the Wood Elves can use the deep routes to travel between different parts of the map, and I mean incredible distances between one forest to the other, provided they've been healed to a certain degree. A more minor but still rather effective means of moving around the map is the World Route stance, which allows them to ignore pesky terrain penalties like mountains to quickly position themselves for a surprise attack or a defensive action should you need to. The Wood Elves also have a council mechanic, which lords can then be assigned to for different bonuses faction-wide, and honestly, at this point it feels like nearly every faction has some boardroom functionality to assign bonus stats or a buff these days. I mean, I'm personally waiting for the future update for the Warriors of Chaos leaderboard function, or the Greenskins Ooze the Hardest council mechanic in future updates. Anyway, one of the most important aspects of any Wood Elf campaign is the Oak of Ages, a massive tree of life, so to speak, that all the Wood Elf factions collectively rely upon. If it falls to another non-Wood Elf faction, your campaign is over. The Oak, however, is pretty well defended, and it can be upgraded to give your faction buffs across the board, as well as being upgraded like a regular settlement, allowing it to unlock stronger defensive garrison troops for the inevitable raids by slavering hordes of beastmen or crazy questing Bretonian knights. So, the Wood Elves are basically tree-hugging hippies who violently protect their forests without remorse and want very little to do with the rest of the wider world, provided the wider world leaves them alone. It does give a different kind of style of campaign play outside of the usual conquer everything in sight and take all the other factions stuff mechanics. Instead, you play as the world's most aggressive garden centre. But who leads these reclusive tree-dwelling snipers? Let's have a look, shall we? The overall ruler of the Wood Elves as a faction is Orion, the King of the Woods. In-game, he leads the faction named Talsin, and starts right next to the Oak of Ages inside Athel Loren. Orion is the immortal king of the Wood Elves and has a vested interest in body art and the art of inflicting pain. He counts as a hybrid melee ranged unit, being able to throw his magical spear toward the foe and instantly reform it in his hand for another throw. He has the anti-infantry, armor-piercing, forest stalker, and causes terror traits. The first two make sense given the whole spear and throwing thereof. Forest Stalker grants bonus melee defense and accuracy when fighting in a forest, which fits the theme obviously. Orion causing terror makes sense given he is quite large and not very elf-looking as creatures go. Most opponents wouldn't know what to do when a largely naked muscular green man with a spear leaps out of the trees at you. Certainly grounds to give you the heebie-jeebies. Attribute-wise, Orion has Siege Attacker to smash gates or walls with his magical spear. He can accurately throw his spear while on the move, can Vanguard deploy, causes fear and terror, encourages nearby friendlies, can hide in forests, he never routs, can pass through trees without movement penalty, and has Frenzy. Suffice to say he isn't lacking in many areas given his status as the Grand High Treehugger of all Treehuggers. His personal Lord effects enable the Wild Hunt event, which is a flat buff across the board for his armies that grant faster cooldown for deep route traversal, increased campaign movement range after raising a settlement, and giving Orion increased speed, melee attack, and charge bonuses. He reduces the upkeep and recruitment cost of all cavalry by 15%, grants a plus 10 leadership to his troops during forest battles, and elite forest spirit units cost amber to recruit, so that's a bit of a downside to the last one. His Lord trait gives the passive Guardian ability when his bit on the side Ariel is embedded in the army, while all armies faction-wide get a 5% missile strength buff. Wild Rhino units get plus 8 to their charge and a 20% base damage buff as well, so overall Orion is a pretty solid starting leader for the Wood Elves. He doesn't rout, has great abilities and works as a hybrid ranged melee combatant. Return fire from massed units, though, can be a threat, given he doesn't have the highest armor stat out there, and a sufficiently capable legendary lord can tie him up in combat, or even defeat him should they be a higher level or better equipped. Used in conjunction with your other ranged units, however, he can do big damage to large single target units, like giants for instance, and, when the time is right, sending him into the fray to rack up those big kill numbers. Building an army around Wild Riders is a good idea, given the bonuses that he applies to those troops, as he can create a fast attack force that can harry from range and strike from unexpected angles. On the other end of the forest of Athel-Loren, we have another legendary lord in the form of the Angry Ent Durthu, and he leads the Aguilong faction, a couple of provinces north of Orion. Durthu has been around since the year dot, essentially. I mean, he's seen it all, and was one of the most vocal advocates for the elves being able to set up a knock-off Mirkwood in the forest to begin with. He regrets that decision now, and as a giant treeman, he's considered a monster or monstrous unit on the field, and works as a hybrid warrior and spellcaster, wielding the Law of Beasts. He's armoured against normal attacks, unless they are armour-piercing, and as a forest spirit he gains further resistance to normal attacks, and in return he causes magical damage. And finally, his attacks count as armor piercing, which makes sense since no amount of enchanted breastplate is going to protect you from being clubbed by a massive tree repeatedly. Attributes wise, he's a siege attacker who rightly causes fear and terror. He can hide in forests by just being a tree, encourages nearby units, and he can also vanguard deploy. He is a literal woodsman with no movement penalty in the woods since he is the woods, and when bracing he completely negates charge bonuses from enemy troops with a 20% physical damage resistance, 15% missile resistance, and even a 25% fire resistance. Tank doesn't quite describe him accurately, really. Baneblade might be more appropriate. But wait, there's more. All units in his army are immune to attrition, all forest spirit units are 30% cheaper upkeep wise, all treemen in his army gain the Annoyance of Netling's passive, which is a hex that causes any enemy unit near them to suffer a base weapon, armor-piercing weapon damage, and melee attack debuff. All Treekin in the army gain the Resplendence of Luminescence passive, which increases their base weapon, armor-piercing attack, and melee attack stats as well. Durthu is powerful, that goes without saying, but he's still vulnerable in a few ways. Given his size, he's an easy target for ranged units, and despite having those generous armor damage reduction stats, he will still succumb to regular volleys of fire from opposing troops. Fire is still a threat for him as well, and any unit that wields it is a priority for takedown. Another factor is, given his size, he counts as a large unit, and thus any unit with the anti-large trait can do more direct damage to him and become a threat as well. But don't be too cautious, he's a tough fighter and he should be sent into the melee to act as the anchor for your force with the support that he provides. In the far west of the map, you can find the Heralds of Ariel faction, led by the Sisters of Twilight. These twins enjoy nothing more than aggravating the local Dark Elves of Nagaroth and improving the Witchwood that they call home. The twins are known as Arahan and Nistra, and they're sort of the light and dark side of each other, the usual young adult mysterious duo theme. Arahan will cut your head off but be quite polite about it, while Nistra will spare your life and make you feel like you, well, were quite bad for even bothering them in the first place, so you just wish you were dead anyway. They both soar into battle on the back of their giant eagle mount, counting as a monstrous beast, allowing them to rain arrows down on their unfortunate targets. As such, their attacks are armor-piercing, and they can even switch between a different ammo type, being able to fire larger single shots for big target damage, known as the Talon of Dawn, or multi-shot, the Talon of Dusk, to cause damage to large bodies of infantry. Also, due to their mount, they're also counted as very fast, so you can keep them out of danger quite easily. By using the Talon of Dawn, you can also attack gates and walls to help during sieges. They're immune to any attrition from forests, they cause fear, encourage friendly troops nearby, and they can fire on the move. A neat upgrade for the Sisters as they level up is the ability to swap that stuffy old bird mount for a nasty looking forest dragon, and they do look awesome. Troops in the Sisters army have reduced upkeep for missile units, a melee attack buff and charge bonus for flying units, giving you an emphasis on fast moving forces accompanied by plenty of missile infantry. Obviously, they're ranged powerhouses, but like Durthu, they are large targets. They are easily targeted and quickly brought down under intense missile fire should the enemy get the chance to do so. Large flying enemy units like dragons can be a major threat for them as well, since they do rely entirely on their mount to do the melee fighting for them, and they also have no magic resistance, which makes ranged attacks from mages a factor, and something you should keep in mind when engaging factions led by wizards, or those that bring mages with them. Still, the Sisters of Twilight are a powerful combo, capable of whittling down the foe before they can bring their full strength to bear, allowing your troops time to mop up once the arrows have stopped raining. The final LL, the slang, is the other angry tree person in the form of Dryad and her faction, the Wargrove of Woe. Dryad isn't the most supportive of this whole elf and treekin arrangement. In fact, she's so unsupportive of the idea that any elf in her force is effectively a slave, entranced to her will and forced to do her bidding. Being the Dryad equivalent of a Karen, she has quite a lot of anger built up in her, and it's reflected in her roster selection. Aside from the regular elves being mind-controlled, her version of tree spirit units like Treekin, Dryads and Treemen are all malevolent versions that feature the frenzy trait. They can be trained at a lower level as well compared to the other Wood Elf factions. Her spellcasters have access to different spell lists, and probably the more unique element here is her ability to summon the wild beasts of the forest to her side. Giant wolves, cave bats, giant spiders, great hawks, feral bears, even manticores will heed her call to battle. The main trade-off here is that she can't train higher Wood Elf units, only having access to the basic level, but it isn't a terrible loss given the effectiveness of Tier 1 Wood Elf infantry, and any tree spirit units, they're pretty good in a ruck. The Wargrove of Woe starts in the Griffin Woods, wedged between the Vampire Counts, Kislev and the local Empire factions, and it can be a little tricky to expand since you have to contend with the vampiric corruption nearby, and having to weigh up attacking the local human factions and risk losing the buffer that they provide when chaos get going, or allying with them and risk being drawn into conflict with more powerful enemies should they come a-knocking. Dryad's faction have a upkeep reduction for all Dryad, Treekin and Treeman units in their armies, 10%, but there's a 10% increase in upkeep for all elf units in her armies. She starts with a single amber for research, and her glamoured elf units are counted as expendable meat shields, so they have reduced stats. Her unique diplomatic traits make it rather hard to work well with the other elf hippies, since she hates wood elves. But what of Dryad? Well, she is a powerful Dryad wizard, with the Forest Spirit and Frenzy traits. Forest Spirit will grant her a decent amount of physical resistance to normal attacks and makes her melee attacks magical in nature, while Frenzy just makes her more dangerous when her leadership is higher. Attribute-wise, she can attack gates and walls and sieges, cause fear, is immune to psychological effects like terror and fear itself, encourages nearby friendlies, has vanguard deployment, can pass through woods without movement penalty, has a 20% damage reduction against physical attacks, reduces missile damage by 15%, and even resists fire by 25%. As a lord, she reduces control in any enemy province that she enters by a whole 5 points, increases Dryad melee attack by 5 points along with a 10% weapon strength bonus for Dryads as well, and she has the Roused to Wrath ability, spawning units of Dryads similar to the spells like Summon Zombie or Skaven Slaves. This all sounds impressive, it certainly was a lot to rattle off, but keep in mind she's a wizard, and thus shouldn't be going toe-to-toe with Kolek's Sun Eater. She won't wither away instantly in a scrap, but she also won't win the battle like Lurbor either. You have to keep her and use her like any other wizard, in that you have her close to the lines to fling spells and encourage troops, but be ready to throw them in to break a unit quicker or to stiffen your own troops' defences if things are looking a bit dicey. She doesn't get any mounts either, so compared to other factions who can upgrade to fast-moving or flying mounts, she runs the risk of being isolated or attacked by mounted heroes or lords looking to quickly eliminate your commander. But what is a legendary lord without their underlings to lead those throwaway armies, to soak up losses and draw away the bulk of those enemy armies on the campaign map, am I right? The generic lords are ready to lay down their lives to make your legendary lords all the more effective. The Glade Lord is the regular Wood Elf option. A hybrid ranged melee specialist, they are capable combatants, with access to a selection of active abilities such as Foe Seeker and Deadly Onslaught that augment their melee capabilities. The other two active abilities for them are Arrow of Kurnos and Prey of Anathrema. These enhance the ranged deck of cards. The Arrow of Kurnos does big guaranteed range damage, while Prey of Anathrema roots a target to the spot and massively reduces their range damage defense to make them easy targets for your archers. Glade Lords have the Duelist attribute that make them perfect for fighting other lords or heroes to do big damage and potentially take them off the field quickly. Forest Stalker increases their defense and accuracy when they're fighting in forests because they're tree people. Other attributes include Encourage, Hide, Fire on the Move, and Woodsman. Another nice element is their ranged attacks count as magic, since their bows fire magically infused arrows. And of course, no lord would be complete without their trusty steeds, and Glade Lords do get a fine selection, starting off with Elven steeds. Although, do they have pointy ears or something to make them elven? It's never really explained what makes them elven. There's the Great Stag if you own the Twisted and Twilight DLC, and then the Giant Eagle, and finally, to really round it out, a Forest Dragon, just to put the boot in. Other Ents also lead armies when Durthu's sleeping, and they're just as powerful in both melee combat and spell flinging. Ancient Treemen are monstrous units with the armoured, charged defense against large foes, forest spirits so their attacks magical, and spellcasting attributes. Like Durthu, they cause fear and terror, they can smash down walls of settlements and doors, they encourage nearby friendlies, they hide in the trees like the VC, and they resist any normal attacks, missile attacks, and some fire pretty well. Having access to the Law of Life allows them to heal and buff friendly troops around them while standing in the middle of the fray like a pissed off Christmas tree brought to life by a child's ill-thought wish. It does take a lot to kill a Treeman, but it can be done should enough force be applied. Usually, a hell of a lot of ranged fire will whittle them down eventually, but spells that have decent single target element damage or sufficiently equipped lords can, if nothing else, keep him busy so he can't help the rest of his pale-skinned elf army. Dryad has access to a malevolent version of a Treeman who has access to slightly different spell lists, and they look a bit spookier, but functionally they're exactly the same. Spellweavers are your generic magical lord for a Wood Elf army. Outside of having amazing hairstyle sense, the Spellweaver can wield numerous laws of magic from beasts, dark, high, life, and shadows. This allows you to build a force around your particular choice of spell list. Spellweavers have the Forest Stalker, Wizard, and Spellcaster attributes along with Woodsman, Missile Resistance, and Encourage. Now, Spellweavers aren't very fast given the fact that they float rather than fly, and walking is so low a class they just don't do that anymore. But should you need some improved movement speed, the Spellweaver can unlock a few mounts such as the Elven Steed, Unicorn, and finally a Giant Eagle. All are key to keeping them out of the fight though. If you do end up going into the brawl, they do blast foes with magical energy, which naturally does cause magical damage, which isn't bad. Of course, they aren't good melee fighters by any stretch, and you should only throw them into the melee when you're out of mana and you're winning the battle cleanly, so you want to get in there to earn a few kills for more experience post-battle. Don't let them become the target of ranged units if you can, since Spellweavers don't like getting their hair messed up with all those arrows. It took them hours to get it to stand up like that, and it's just the way they want it. Of course, Lords can't feel superior without some heroes to boss around, and the Wood Elves have a good spread of these as well, ranging from lesser versions of the Lord characters to actually a couple of unique ones. Looking at the basic heroes first though, we have the Hairdresser in training in the form of the Spell Singer. These useful battle mages can float into battle utilising the spell laws of shadows, beasts or life, and it allows you to tailor some of your magic around either damage output, healing or hexing, and a Spell Singer in a force led by a Spellweaver can add up for some significant damage, at the cost of a solid frontline fighter. Spell Singers get the same mount upgrades as their blue-haired betters from the Elven Steed, the Unicorn and the Eagle to keep them from being clubbed to death by any angry infantry that get close enough. Spell Singers also suffer the same drawbacks that most wizards do in that lots of sharp, pointy things shot at them kill them pretty rapidly. The Waste Stalker is what you would likely want as a bodyguard for a Spellweaver Lord. A hybrid weapon specialist like all Wood Elves, they excel in long-range single-target damage with their bows, and when the time calls for it, they can slap the enemy general or hero in the face with a branch that has naturally fallen to the ground, there's no snapping here, and then challenge them to a duel. As a duelist, the Waste Stalker can make short work of enemy lords or heroes. At the very least they can hold them up for some time so you can focus down enemy armies. The big trick of the Waste Stalker is their Master Ambusher trait, which allows them to hide in any terrain and fire on the move. Waste Stalkers overall are pretty good all-round characters, with a few drawbacks, but some things to keep in mind are his low ammo count. You might be best to keep them on standby for specific targets before you start letting the arrows fly. The other factor is the lack of mobility. He's fast, but they're faster, and if any of the faster moving units like Cavalry detect the Waste Stalker, he won't be able to get away in time and you'll just end up either being routed or tied up in a fight against a unit you never wanted him to engage. The Branch Wraith is an interesting unit, as they work as a kind of super Dryad, featuring the spellcasting abilities of the Branch Wraith, the regular combat abilities of the Dryad, and this means that they're resistant to physical attacks, missile attacks, and a little bit of fire, while also throwing out a mixed spell list of life and shadow spells. Alongside the damage dealing traits and the Forest Spirit, it could be a real frontline murder machine. Honestly, the Branch Wraith is one of the stronger choices for a Wood Elf force, since they can buff frontline troops like Eternal Guard or Dryads to increase their attack and defense, while also being able to heal and deliver massive damage to enemy troops engaged with them. The main weakness then is the same as any regular Dryad, which is their lower armour. Despite being an actual living tree, it somehow takes more damage when hit compared to, say, the Waste Stalker. I mean, if I hit a tree with a sword, I'm pretty sure it would hurt me more than I would hurt it. And keep in mind that this is a living tree person with wood boobs and everything. This thing should be no-selling hits like Cena or Hogan and the Road Warriors all combined. Branch Wraiths do also struggle in the speed department since they have no natural mounts and can be isolated by, say, a unit of cavalry or flying units, so if you keep them close to the front line to avoid this scenario, it shouldn't be a worry. Should you play as Dryker, you do have a few malevolent versions of Branch Wraiths, which work functionally the same but have different laws of magic to play with, like shadows, beasts and life instead of the hybrid spellcaster from other Wood Elf factions. Finally, we have the Glade Captain. These heroes round out the tactical options available to you, with this hero being best suited to anti-large work. Like most Wood Elf heroes and lords, the Glade Captain is a hybrid fighter, capable of fighting in both melee and range combat as required. They have Forest Stalker, Armor Piercing and Anti-Large traits, alongside nifty guided projectile traits which ensure that no arrow will miss their target. You can even fire this in first person mode and guide the bolt yourself. Attributes wise, Glade Captains can encourage nearby troops, they can fire on the move, have charge defense against large units, reflect any charge damage when they brace, they can Vanguard deploy, they're a woodsman and they resist missile damage by 15% and get a 20% discount at Asda. Overall, not bad and perfect for dropping those pesky Minotaurs, Trolls, Cavalry or anything else that's counted as large that you may encounter. Leveling them up will provide you with more mounts ranging from the trusty Elven Steed to the Great Stag and the Great Eagle, making them more deadly on the field and able to better counter those large threats. Cons wise, the Glade Captain fires rather slow for a unit dedicated to anti-large work, with a 10-second reload between shots. This means you're either going to have to micromanage every shot to get the best out of their abilities, or sit them behind the line and hope that the AI just picks a decent target, which inevitably it doesn't. Just turn off auto-fire. Due to the low armour that most Wood Elves suffer from, twigs and leaves being terrible armour, who would have guessed it, Captains can't tank hits for very long, meaning you'll want to avoid any melee attacks unless the enemy is far weaker than them or they're joining an existing fight where they can better assist the unit before they move on for another target. And would you Adam and Eve it, the Wood Elves even have legendary heroes to recruit to the cause. the most powerful of which is Ariel, the good lady wife of Orion. He mentions her quite often. She embodies the forest of Aguilong itself, and can be recruited in Immortal Empire campaigns by completing a single ritual of rebirth on a forest. When you get this butterfly elf hybrid, you'll have a powerful spellcaster in your army, having access to the laws of dark, high, and life magic. She causes terror, and as a forest spirit is naturally resistant to normal attacks and projectiles, while also being able to smack foes back with magical energies of her own. Ariel is resistant to all attrition types in Aguilong, causes fear and terror, encourages friendly units, can vanguard deploy, hide somehow, ignores terrain penalties for movement because she flutters by, and is resistant to physical damage for 20% and missile damage for 15%. She can't unlock any mounts because she can fly anyway. Well, not really fly, sort of flutter about and be infatuated with butterfly bushes for some reason. And as a spellcaster, she can do some serious damage to your foes with Tempest and Dwellers Below, while hexing troops with Word of Pain or Soul Stealer, and buffing with Apotheosis. Of course, if you throw enough bodies or a few bruiser types her way to cause damage, she'll eventually rout or be put down by you normally, but you don't want your mages going in for fisticuffs, so you want to keep her behind the lines and encourage chucking an odd spell out like that, like it's going out of fashion. The other legendary hero is Quadil. That may not be pronounced correctly, but it looks Welsh, and as such I'm hopelessly incapable of pronouncing it correctly, though I do prefer to call the country Cymru instead. That random bit aside, he's basically a narky treeman who hates elves and sides with Dryad. Some different spells are his main difference really, but the same tactics apply here as any treeman. And, well, that certainly ties a little eco-friendly bow on the heroes and lords, which leads neatly into the infantry. Wood Elf infantry are few and far between. They range from average to high damage average. The main focus then of the army is on devastating bow fire, so it isn't really a shock that the Azra without bows suffer somewhat. The most common non-bow elf is the Eternal Guard, which you'll recruit a lot of during your campaigns. They come in two varieties, shielded and unshielded, or as I like to think of them, dies quickly and dies less quickly. Eternal Guard are spear infantry and make short work of any cavalry or large unit dumb enough to run into their spears while they brace. Being Wood Elves, they gain a bonus to melee defense and accuracy when they're fighting in forested terrain, and also easily pass through any forested terrain without penalty. The lack of shields for the standard unit means that they can be felled quite quickly due to their lower defense, and the unit size overall is small for a tier 1 infantry, meaning that they can be enveloped by larger units of tier 1 infantry quickly, and even surrounded. Shielded Eternal Guard do better in the survival department as a tier 2 version of the unit, but they have the same unit size drawback, so they can't spread out as much to form a solid line as, say, Bretonnia, Dwarves, or Empire Infantry can. The higher average stats do mean that they can keep fighting a little longer, but support is usually recommended to keep them from routing. Generally, your Eternal Guard are cheap enough to replace and solid enough to work as a speed bump for the enemy, while your more capable units do the majority of the killing. The humble Dryad is your starting alternative frontline trooper. These extremely aggressive tree women are counted as damage dealers to put the hurt on any unit their size or smaller. As forest spirits, they deal magical damage and resist most physical attacks to some degree. They can vanguard deploy for ambushes or just to rush the front line quickly and tie up the enemy. They cause fear, are immune to fear and terror themselves, and have the same resistances as Treemen and Treekin. Armour is their biggest weakness. Anything wearing a half-decent set will just seriously impede Dryad damage potential, and that isn't much of a shock then when you think that clawed wooden hands aren't really going to go through armour very easily. Conversely though, anything with magical attacks of their own or fire will also quickly kill a Dryad in return, so the best deployment for Dryads is rushing the front and keeping the enemy rank and file in place alongside your Eternal Guard. If anything well armoured or well equipped turns up, you just leave them to your ranged troops or specialists to destroy, or your unit of angry animated bonsai trees will be kindling fairly quickly. Wardancers are a more capable melee killer. These all-female dual sword-wielding gold-looking infantry are the glass cannons of the Wood Elf front line, with some explosive damage potential, and all of the damage resistances of a pane of sugar glass. Wardancers have Forest Stalker for better stats while they fight in forests. They're counted as anti-infantry, have the Shadow Dancers of Loek, and they have the Dodge attribute. They can also hide in forests, are immune to fear and terror, and have a 20% physical damage resistance trait. Helps a bit. All sounds great on paper, and when used to flank an already engaged unit or weaker infantry, the Wardancers can make extremely quick work of their foes. However, despite their numerous advantages in dodging attacks and resisting damage, they do have a low health pool, and it only takes a few hits to down a Wardancer or 3. Active abilities like Shadow's Coil and Woven Mist can reduce damage received, but it's also at the cost of their damage output. Never throw them in against anything heavily armoured or larger targets like, say, Minotaurs for instance, since these units will tank the hits and smack arse harder than your mum at the BDSM club. Should you find the need for a unit with a better anti-large stat than the Eternal Guard, you can opt for the Wardancers with Azray Spears. Having the same attributes as the standard Wardancers, they just swap out their anti-infantry stat for anti-large. It means you can more capably counter enemy monsters and cavalry. But again, be mindful that these are fragile warriors with high damage and extremely low armour. Keep them in the second line until they're needed, and then find the best angle to deploy them. Both the regular and spear variety of the Wardancers, I mean. When the well-armoured foes of the Azray rock up, it's time to call in the Wildwood Rangers. These tier 3 glaive infantry are geared specifically for killing anything large and or well armoured. Wildwood Rangers are damage dealers as well, so their prey will die quickly once the fighting starts. But all of this sounds too good to be true, and of course there are some caveats to all of this. The main issue is the same as all Wood Elf units, and that's armour and staying power in a ruck. The Wood Elves just aren't capable of standing toe to toe with enemy infantry as well as other combinations. Despite the acrobatic routines and interpretive dance, any hit will floor them like CM Punk back in the UFC. Wildwood Rangers are a solid counter to armoured troops or flanking cavalry, but you'll always want to keep your eye on them if the fight goes on too long, and consider bringing some fire support their way to reduce any losses and also to see the enemy off a little quicker. The final melee troop of the Wood Elf forces is the Blade Singers, a kind of Super Saiyan form of the Wardancer. They're dual-wielding sword users who counters anti-infantry and armor-piercing with the same dodge attribute. They have physical damage resistance of 20% and are immune to fear and terror. Their Whirling Death and Shadow's Coil active abilities can augment defense when needed or damage to wrap things up quickly. As the elite tier infantry of the Wood Elves, they can do some impressive damage to most units that they encounter, sometimes just outright buzzsawing their way through tier 1 units like they aren't even there. Even opposing enemy infantry elites will break out in a sweat fighting them. The only effective counter to these women of the blade is a good old projectile. You put enough lead or arrows in the air and Blade Singers will start catching them. Spells can work well too if your aim is good, so your main focus should be on holding them back long enough to then deploy the Blade Singers and watch the bodies hit the floor. Honestly speaking, the main strength of any Wood Elf force then is the Archer. Some of the best, if not the best, archers exist amongst the Wood Elves in Warhammer 3, and they can do some remarkable damage for their relatively small unit size. The most commonly seen ranged unit of the Azray is the Glade Guard, and they'll form the main damage component of pretty much any campaign force you have. Set up in a forest, they gain the Forest Stalker buff to increase their melee defense and accuracy, while good range means that they can fire much further than most, if not all, ranged infantry in the game. Couple this with their ability to fire on the move accurately, you have the potential to massively reduce the enemy frontline before they even get a whiff of the all-natural shampoo that the Wood Elves use to keep their hair so silky smooth. Other variety of Glade Guard do exist, such as the Hagbane tips who inflict poison on the foe, which sadly does not do damage over time, as I've mentioned before. But it does reduce their damage, the enemy speed and their vigour. Starfire Shafts, on the other hand, can do big armour-piercing damage once you have the requisite unlocks. And like any archer infantry though, once the front line is broken and the enemy get into face-smashing distance, things get a little less pretty. Obviously, it isn't a good idea to throw a Glade Guard into a fight unless you absolutely have to, or say they've run out of ammunition and you just need the bodies to hold the line. Though if it's gotten to that point, you've likely been doing it wrong. Deepwood Scouts are a more specialised ranged unit compared to the more general Glade Guard. Deepwood Scouts can vanguard deploy for better firing positions earlier in the fight, while Stalk, combined with their Master Ambush traits, can let them hide in any terrain and fire in any direction on the move. Their attacks are magical as well, allowing them to overcome certain damage reduction abilities, and they're able to run and shoot in any direction, helping them when they're being chased by slower moving infantry. That said, any cavalry unit can and will chase them down without mercy. You won't bring many Deepwood Scouts to a battle during a campaign because of the higher cost and more specialised nature of this unit, but if you have them set and ready to start laying into the enemy's rear line or flanking fire on the move, they can do big damage. The other Deepwood Scout alternative is the Swift Shiver Shard, and try saying that 10 times quickly. The main difference here is that the shards themselves are capable of firing 2 magical arrows at once instead of 1. There's a big drawback though, is that the range is reduced to do this. Swift Shiver Scouts are better placed behind the line rather than sneaking around the battlefield, where their higher damage output can focus down single enemy units and kill them quickly. The final ranged infantry unit is the Way Watcher. These elite tier units fire armor-piercing missiles, have good range, fire whilst hidden in any terrain, and have the usual Forest Stalker and Fire on the Move abilities. Their hawkish precision passive grants them more armor-piercing damage, and overall they can kill enemy elite troops, cavalry, and even characters frighteningly fast. Keep their ammo in mind and don't let them just fire on the old rank and file. That's the work for the Glade Guard. You want to choose the lucky winner for the Way Watcher arrow barrage, so a good idea is to turn off fire at will. Keep them protected with as many squishy bodies as possible, and they can turn the tide. Should you encounter them, the best solution is fast-moving cavalry to flank or high-focus spell damage or massed return missile volleys, anything to either tie them up in the melee or kill them to reduce their deadly return volleys. Now, cavalry isn't something that immediately springs to mind when you think of the Wood Elves. Normally, you would picture their beady little eyes staring out at you from a shrub or tree, so the idea of large formations of horses or other mounts rushing your position is a distant second. However, these green-fingered knife-ears do have a small selection of cavalry units ready to cause the usual trouble that mounted troops normally get up to. The basic unit you will find in the roster is the Glade Riders with spears. These are your base cavalry unit, replete with Warhammer 1 low-poly, flat-textured horses. The riders are shielded for better arrow protection, they're very fast and have Forest Stalker and Vanguard deployment. They need these advantages because they are extremely fragile like cavalry units. They're best employed to flank wide and hit enemy artillery or the archer line to quickly roll them up, and also to make fast rear charges before they fade away. Do not put Glade Riders into any kind of melee fight, even against normal low-tier infantry, that they should have an advantage against, because they will suffer large casualties to get that victory. The only other use I can think of them for is to hold up enemy cavalry trying to flank your line long enough for any Eternal Guard units to spear them, but always expect to have a shadow of the former unit to fight after this. Wild Riders, though, are something more durable and harder hitting for when you need to punch through the enemy line or send that line unit packing. Wild Riders are shock cavalry and do best when charging the enemy's flanks or rear. They have the Damage Dealer, Forest Stalker, Frenzy and Vanguard attributes, meaning they do more damage than average, they gain bonuses when they're fighting in the woods or forests, cause more damage with high leadership, and can ambush early on in the battle. They cause fear and have a 20% physical damage resistance due to their unearthly gifts of Kurnos. Wild Riders also have a shielded version for higher survivability against missile fire, and together they can do a lot of damage quickly if allowed to run the map unchecked. Properly supported by magic, they can increase their damage and health while driving home the charge. Typically, you'll want to make sure that they don't get singled out by arrows or bullets or get bogged down in the melee, as they are still Wood Elves and they lack armour, and they will die quickly. The Premium Battle Pass Super Deluxe Collector's Pre-Order Edition of the Wood Elf Cavalry, though, are the Great Stagnites. These resplendent bastards ride into battle atop magical monstrous stags that are the size of ogres. The size of ogres! Unsurprisingly, they are armor-piercing due to the massive antlers, very fast and have Vanguard deployment. They cause fear and have frenzy alongside the physical damage resistances of the Wild Riders. Great Stagnites are extremely powerful in the charge and in the scrum against armoured foes, and should be used to crush the nastiest looking unit on the field with a massive charge before either retreating to do it all again or stay in the fight and mop up. Granted, on Ultra size, these units only get 32 models of a single unit, but that equates to 32 ogre-sized stags slamming into your troops, so it's just painful. Of course, they are expensive to train and to upkeep, but these are worth it. Keep them safe from any massed return missile fire and any magic flinging opponents, or just any unit that specialises in anti-large combat, since they are counted as monstrous as well. They are subject to those disadvantages, but outside of that, you're golden. Missile cavalry is something more in the wheelhouse of the Azray, however, and the most commonly seen mounted unit is the Glade Riders with bows. These fast-moving missile cavalry can harass from range and easily retreat from any foe trying to tie them down in the melee. They can vanguard deploy, fire on the move, and have Forest Stalker, so you can easily run in and out of the trees on a map, gain the benefit of the Forest Stalker trait, and also pass through any trees without any terrain penalty. You also get the Hagbane tipped version of these Glade Riders to further pile on the misery by poisoning any unit they hit, and just generally being a massive annoyance. Obviously, like any light cavalry with bows, they fall down dead from a stiff breeze, and avoiding melee at all costs is key. If they run out of ammo, they can kind of sort of work as a shock cavalry in a pinch, but don't expect miracles here. Hawk Riders are the fast-moving annoyance on the new level, given that they aren't even touching the bleeding ground. Their unit size is small, but since they can move very quickly and fire on the move, they can rapidly redeploy anywhere needed, harassing with arrows and moving away to their next target with little impediment. Hawk Riders have the armor-piercing melee attribute, which applies to their mounts, who can do good damage to armoured units when you set them to melee. The main drawback here is survivability, and of that of the rider who decided to go to war wearing nothing but a smile, and thus anything that hits them will kill them quickly. It's a trade-off that works because when a unit is engaged and you need something to tear through the armour, your Hawks can do that and hopefully run them off or fly away before anything swats back at you. Also, be aware that any return fire from enemy troops, Hawk Riders are weak to range fire and they'll die rather quickly when they come under fire like this. The final unit of the Wood Elf Cavalry is the Sisters of the Thorne. These elite spellcasting warriors are a solid range support unit, capable of casting Shield of Thorns to buff troops, and the Curse of Andrahir to debuff stronger targets for missile attack. They can sit on the second line of the army, firing at the enemy and casting support spells, while also being semi-capable of charging attacks to aid in the melee. Their speed allows them to keep away from enemy cavalry and still fire back on the move, and generally they can be relied upon to hold their own long enough for any support troops to arrive should they end up in a scrap. They can be expensive, and generally you'll only want one of these units in your force to act as a support for one of your elite troops like Blade Singers or Treemen to increase the damage output and keep them fighting longer. Overall, one of the best units in the roster, and should be deployed as soon as possible. One of the things I like most about any faction in Total War Warhammer as a series is the monster selection, and the Friends of the Wood Elves deliver. The first tier of monster that you bring into battle is the Treekin. You know, in Warhammer 40k you have dreadnoughts with a chunk of some basically dead space marine animating a walking death machine. Well, Treekin are kind of the Wood Elf soul animating version of this, just with a tree facsimile of a person, kind of, sort of, who goes into battle. These monstrous infantry are armoured, and they're forest spirits with charged defense against large foes. They cause fear, they have the same physical fire and missile resistances that Treemen have, and can attack walls and doors of any settlements. They're basically tanks, capable of holding the front line for ages, provided they aren't being hit with magical attacks or fire. They can hold an enemy unit in place for your other troops to get the job done elsewhere on the field. The Treeman is essentially the same as the previous Treemen mentioned earlier here in the video. They hit hard, they take a long time to kill, and they act as a Wood Elf equivalent of the Greenskins Giant unit, for instance. A single Treeman in an army on the campaign map can act as the anchor for your front line, sweeping troops aside with their literal tree branch arms, and punch through most armour due to their magical attacks. Letting a Treeman become isolated is probably the worst thing you can do, since their morale will break quickly and many smaller attacks will take their toll on their hit points. Front and centre is their place on the field, and swinging like a, swinging like a bad tree, really. Great Eagles are decent early to mid-game monsters, and fairly common at that point because of the mounts that your heroes will get. They're extremely fast, they're armour-piercing, and they're capable of causing fear. They can be decent to go to for archer hunting roles or artillery killing due to their speed, and they start though to underperform once you have higher tier units that can basically do the same job in larger numbers, like Great Stagnites for instance. Extended battles aren't good for Great Eagles since they tend to tire quite quickly and don't have the damage output to down heroes or lords, nor do they have much resistance to attacks. meaning that they can rout unexpectedly. Arrows and bullets also play merry hell with the Great Eagle, and given the size of the beast, it has a tough time dodging them. The Forest Dragon is a pretty damn cool looking unit with those massive antlers and its mossy skin. It makes for a rather unique dragon model. This flying monster hits with armor piercing damage, causes terror, has soporific breath, and causes magical damage due to it being a forest spirit. Add on physical damage resistance to 20%, missile resistance to 25%, and you have a pretty decent dragon for your force of wood nymphs and tree huggers. That said, as you can see from my footage here, the Forest Dragon can be bested easily by a Lord on Manticore if you fail to pay attention, and that's because it is actually one of the weaker dragons in the entire game. It relies heavily on its natural poison attacks to weaken foes, and the Forest Dragon is best employed when it's swooping down on units already engaged, smashing them away, or blasting clumps of infantry with its breath weapon for massive damage. Lords or heroes can easily go all Dragon Slayer on it if you just leave it to one of these characters, so micromanage the wee beastie, and things should be fine. Finally, we have the weirdest monster of the entire list, possibly even the entire game, and that includes the Jabba Slife. The Zoets. Or Zoets. These are some kind of result of a dragon ogre getting freaky with a lizard man or something, because they have traits of both. They work as anti-large spellcasters, capable of armor-piercing damage aided by their Forest Spirit trait. They have 25% missile resistance due to their scales, and they cause fear alongside being able to smash walls and doors down. They have 2 innate casts of Earth Blood to heal themselves or nearby friendly troops, and Flesh to Stone for big defense buffs. They work best against units like Cavalry or other monstrous troops like Minotaurs, Ogres, Trolls, anyone supporting Day 1 DLC, that sort of thing. They suffer the same drawbacks as well, given that their size. They can also be whittled down by spear-wielding units or anything that works in the anti-large role. Still, they are a pretty versatile unit, capable of running support or monster hunting duty, and they're pretty resistant to damage for when you need them to get clobbering. And that's it. The Wood Elves I would liken as a glass cannon type of faction. They have smaller numbers on average, but they can do tremendous damage in return with versatile archers, powerful tree spirits, capable heroes and lords, and some pretty hard-hitting monsters. Another side note to make here is that the Wood Elves as a faction are purely DLC. The base group is a group that you will have to buy from Warhammer 1's DLC tab to have access to it in Warhammer 3, and a lot of the units as they were added on will be parts of other DLC such as the Twisted and the Twilight, for instance, adding more of these units. So keep that in mind if you do fancy playing the Wood Elves and you don't already have them in Warhammer 3, you will have to purchase the DLCs to have access to the full roster. But as always, thank you for watching and subscribing, commenting, all that usual stuff. Have a good week, and remember, the next time you're in the woods, you might just be under the watchful eye of the Azrae. Actually, no you won't. They're not real. None of this is real.